So this evening, I thought we'd explore the question, are you a good Samaritan or are you a bad Samaritan? Now, we'll get first to how we're Samaritans, because you may not have thought of yourself as a Samaritan before. And certainly I didn't think of myself as a Samaritan until a few months ago. Whenever I read the New Testament, I was always looking for myself, right? So where am I in these stories? Because that's, if I can figure out who I am in the story, then I can probably maximize how much I learn from the story. And I'd always saw myself as a Pharisee. And I think all of us are Pharisees. Now, you may not have thought of yourself as a Pharisee before, but that may be because you don't have quite an accurate understanding of who these people were. And I think that within our faith communities, we are the Pharisees. But I think outside of our faith community, we are the Samaritans. So let's talk briefly about how we are the Pharisees, which may be a disturbing thought, before I get to the even more disturbing thought that we're the Samaritans. So we tend to think of the Pharisees as those self-righteous jerks that resisted Christ and had a part in his execution. Right? Those were the Pharisees. Some of them did fight Christ. Some of them didn't. Right? Some of them became his disciples. But that wasn't the definition of a Pharisee. You didn't become a Pharisee based on how you interact with Christ, because of course Pharisees were around a long time before Christ and actually a long time after him. So what was it that made you a Pharisee? Well, I'm going to quote Wikipedia, that august journal, which said that fundamentally, the Pharisees continued a form of Judaism that extended beyond the temple, applying Jewish law to mundane activities in order to sanctify the everyday world. This was a more participatory or democratic form of Judaism in which rituals were not monopolized by an inherited priesthood, but rather could be performed by all adult Jews individually or collectively, whose leaders were not determined by birth, but by scholarly achievement. In general, the Pharisees emphasized a commitment to social justice, belief in the brotherhood of mankind, and a faith in the redemption of the Jewish nation and ultimately humanity. Moreover, they believed that these ends would be achieved through the walk, or how to walk, a corpus of laws derived from a very close reading of sacred texts. This belief entailed both a commitment to relate religion to ordinary concerns and daily life, and a commitment to study and scholarly debate. So who does that sound like? Scholars. They were scholars. They were committed to living out their faith in everyday life. That sounds kind of like us. And it gets worse. The Pharisees were not the wealthy or the most powerful, but they generally what we would refer to as the upper middle class, right? So they wouldn't be the pastor, but they would likely be on the board. I mean, everything that they stood for, we would endorse as good things, right? The idea that one shouldn't have power in your society based on birth, but it should be a meritocracy. The idea that religion should affect your daily walk. The idea that if your faith isn't lived out outside the church, it's not a true faith. I mean, this is what the Pharisees were into. The issue they had with Christ, I think partly was the idea that he had a different understanding of their faith than they had an understanding of their faith, and that he wanted to take their faith a lot deeper, but also I think that they started to feel pretty good about themselves, right? So they got a little bit proud and arrogant, and certainly it's been very helpful for me to understand when I look at the Pharisees that this is who I am, and so where did they fall down, right? They fell down on pride and arrogance and an unwillingness to be taught. And so as I watch my life, I'm particularly sensitive to when I see pride and arrogance and an unwillingness to be taught creeping into my life. Because these guys knew it all very well, and yet they missed Christ. So I was making the point that when you read the New Testament, you should look for yourself, right? See where you are in the stories, and that if you look, I've always, since I started doing that, always seen myself as a Pharisee. Right? The person who's learned, the person whose opinion gets sought out at church, the person who's not wealthy but comfortable, the person who, you're not the pastor, but your opinion on theological things is important, and you're really committed to understanding how your faith should be lived out day to day. That's what the Pharisees were into. But they were very prone to pride and arrogance, and hence a lot of them ended up missing Christ. But a speaker a few months ago at my church, preaching about the parable of the Good Samaritan, made sort of the offhand comment that, in Canada, being a minority who's treated very differently, we are the Samaritans. He'd always, when he read the Good Samaritan, tried to figure out, am I the priest or am I the temple assistant? And recently, when he was reading it, he decided that he was a Samaritan in Canada. And then he went on with the rest of his sermon, right? That wasn't the point of his sermon. He went on with the rest of his sermon, and that stuck with me, and I've done a lot of thinking about it, and I've decided that actually I think he's pretty accurate that in Canada, we are the Samaritans. So in the context of my church, I'm a Pharisee. In the context of my society, I'm a Samaritan. So there's 4 references to the Samaritans in the New Testament. We're going to go through all 4 this evening. Some of you, I don't know if you brought your Bible. Of course, the students all have a Bible on their phones. So they've all brought their Bibles, but not on purpose. There you go. So we're going to look at those 4 references. And of course, the parable of the Good Samaritan we will do last, right? Because that's the one that you all know. So that's the one we'll get to last. So I think he was right. So let's start a little bit by talking about who the Samaritans were, right? So we've talked about who the Pharisees were. And the Pharisees probably weren't the people that we understand them to be now. Some of them behave that way. So who are the Samaritans? So at the time of Christ, there was probably about 1 million Samaritans living in the northern part of Israel. And who the Samaritans were depended on who you asked. So if you asked the Samaritans who they were, they would tell you that they were the descendants of Joseph through the tribes of Manasseh and Ephraim. They believed that God had established Mount Gerizim as the center of worship. That's where you properly worship God, and they had built a temple there, and that the descendants of Judah, that other tribe, had moved the center of worship into Jerusalem after the exile. And that was a theological error on the part of those Judahites down to the south. They didn't know what they were doing. And they were the true descendants of Abraham, the true holders of the land, and the Jews were the foreigners who had been corrupted by the Babylonian exile and then come back. Right? So the Samaritans, they were the ones that had it all right. Because if you ask the Jews who the Samaritans were, they had a different understanding of history. So for the Jews, the Samaritans were a mixed people who had resulted from Babylonian resettlement of foreign people into Israel. The temple at Mount Gerizim was an abomination if you were a Jew. Right? This was just something that was unthinkable. It was an abomination. And so this different understanding of history and heritage had created actually a great deal of hatred between the Jews and the Samaritans. And if you know your New Testament, you have a sense of that flavor. Yeah. So what we understand now is that there had been a people in the north who'd been left behind, right? When Babylon had come in and taken out the northern kingdom, there had been a lot of people. They only took the important people and the learned people. Right? They were carried into exile, but they left a lot of the poor people. And there were probably some people who also managed to escape, who hid, right? And certainly the Babylonians actively resettled, right? So there definitely were some Babylonians who were resettled into the northern kingdom, and there was a complete collapse of society, and there definitely probably had been some intermarriage. So as often is the case with historical disputes, there was some element of truth to both sides of the debate. So at the time of Jesus, they were not considered Jewish. They were the Samaritans. But of course, the Samaritans considered themselves to be the true descendants of Abraham, the true keepers of the Jewish faith, whereas the Jews considered them contaminated and an abomination. Right? So some artists have tried to get at this difference by portraying the person who's been the victim of the robbers and the Good Samaritan as part of a different race. Right? So certainly in this image, the Good Samaritan is black and the man who's been beat up is white. But it's not quite, the difference is a lot more subtle, and I think the hatred was more pronounced because the difference was more subtle. But to get at the hatred, does somebody want to look up Luke chapter 9, verses 51 to 56?
As the time approached for him to be taken up to heaven, Jesus resolutely set out for Jerusalem. And he sent messengers on ahead, who went into a Samaritan village to get things ready for him. But the people there did not welcome him, because he was heading for Jerusalem. When the disciples James and John saw this, they asked, "Lord, do you want us to call fire down from heaven to destroy them?" But Jesus turned and rebuked them. Then he and his disciples went to another village.
Right, so the Samaritans here, he's on his way to Jerusalem. They're not going to help him with that. Jerusalem is this abomination. He's headed there, he's a Jew headed there. They don't want any part of it. Of course, the disciples have now spent 3 years with Christ. They've learned love of neighbor. They're very kind. And so their reaction is, Let's call down fire from heaven and destroy the whole place, right? So this is, you get a sense of there's a bit of tension between these two peoples, right? And I think that the tension is partly because they were just different enough to irritate each other, right? When somebody comes from a different land, they have a different history, they dress different, they look different, their food is different, you kind of expect them to have different ways of seeing things and different understandings of things, and that it's going to take some effort for you to figure them out and get along with them. And if you see yourself as normal, you expect them to be different. If you're a little more Canadian and multicultural, you understand that a lot of stuff that they understand is going to be different than you. The problem is when you encounter somebody who dresses the same way as you, who has the same skin color as you, who has the same history as you, who grew up in the same place, was educated in the same schools, shares the same history, and they have a completely different understanding of how things are. That's where actually the tension tends to flare, right? And you have lots of patience for the person who looks different and sounds different, but you don't have much patience for the person that ought to be just like you, because if they're not just like you, then maybe you've got something wrong because you all did the same schooling. How did they end up in such a different place? So you guys have probably already all had encounters like this, right? Where you end up in some sort of dispute, and the basic question is, why can't you just be normal? Right? You look like me, you sound like me, we grew up together, we're all Canadians, we grew up in the same town, and yet you've got such funny ideas about how things ought to be. Why can't you just understand that stuff is good? Right? We all know stuff. We watched cartoons together, didn't we? Stuff is good. Why don't you understand that selfishness is okay if you let others be selfish too? Right? There's nothing wrong with selfishness, there's just problems if you hurt other people. Right? Don't you understand that coexistence is the ultimate good? That's what it's all about. We all learned that in school. You went to the same school I did, didn't you? Right and wrong are just cultural constructs. Right? We all understand this. Maybe some strange people from other cultures don't understand this, but how could you not understand this? If God exists, he or she or it or they aren't all that relevant to life. Right? This is Canada, where we're a secular country. This is normal. People from other cultures believe in funny gods, and we let them do that, but you're one of us. Limitless self-expression is the ultimate good. And then you can insert whatever, right? But at the base of all of this is somebody encountering you and saying, why can't you just be normal? Because what you're encountering is a worldview conflict, right? You've got a certain view of the world, they've got a very different view of the world, and those two worldviews are coming into conflict, and somebody can understand why you've got a different worldview when you're from the same place and speak the same language and all that sort of thing. And if you want more on worldview stuff, I've got talks online, and I'll give you the website at the end, and that's all about worldview. But what's happening essentially is that you're in a worldview conflict. And the person you're interacting with is surprised by the worldview conflict because you don't look like the kind of person that would have a different worldview from them. We're citizens of the same land, we say are the same history, but we have completely different understandings of that history and completely different understanding of what's right and wrong and what we ought to be worshiping and where we ought to be worshiping. So, how to be a good Samaritan? Because we're that group that the mainstream just doesn't quite understand, and that creates a bit of tension. So I think step number one of being a good Samaritan is to understand how you actually are different than the culture around you. So the Samaritans, there are still Samaritans around. They're a small tribe. They've done some good genetic analysis and proven that they're Jews, and so they're part of the nation of Israel. They're accepted as Jews, and they still worship on Mount Gerizim, which is in the West Bank. And this picture was taken in 2006 at one of their religious ceremonies on Mount Gerizim. So if you're a Samaritan in the land of Israel, you understand that you're a small cultural and religious minority, and you probably don't expect the dominant culture to really understand or pay much attention to you. Right? You don't expect that everyone's going to think the way you do. You don't expect that anyone else is going to join you as you do your religious ceremony on the top of Mount Gerizim. And there's no temple there anymore. But you can still see where the temple foundations were, and they still worship at that place. So this still happens. And I think if you're a faithful Christ follower, you need to be immersed in his world. You need to understand what that means. But then when you interact with the rest of the world, you shouldn't be surprised when there's huge differences. You're actually going to be pleasantly surprised when there's points of connection. That's what should surprise you. Really, there's a connection there. And we're looking towards Christ to seek truth, And we recognize that the world has a completely different understanding of truth that could potentially corrupt us. And so you're not looking as a member of a cultural and religious minority in a broader society, you don't have much expectations that anything will be congruent with the larger society. So step one of being a good Samaritan is to understand we're Samaritans. This is who we are in the culture, and that may change what you expect of the culture. So if you're going to be a good Samaritan, you're not going to be the Samaritan that frustrates Christ's efforts and generally seeks to breathe down fire and destruction on all those who disagree with you, right? Because that's what the disciples wanted to do, and I certainly occasionally hear Christians talking about how it's going to be really good when all of those who disagree are just taken out, right? And the fire from heaven is going to sort it all out. So I hope that that's not what you aspire to do. I hope you actually aspire to be salt and light in the culture around you. But I think we need to understand that when we're doing that, you're actually doing cross-cultural ministry, right? So if God called you to be a missionary in some part of the world where there was no Christianity, some Muslim or Hindu or Buddhist or whatever, pantheistic culture, you would go there with certain expectations, right? And you would be prepared, and you would actually do an entire probably 6 or 12 or 18 months of training in cross-cultural ministry. You'd do a whole bunch of Bible college so you understand Christianity very well, and you'd learn the language, and you'd learn the culture, and then you would go expecting to be a foreigner. I think if you want to go about being a Christian witness in the medical community in Canada, the same thing applies. You are a foreigner doing cross-cultural ministry. So cross-cultural ministry, the first thing to recognize is it's actually really hard to do. It's way easier to be a witness within your own cultural group. And it's interesting that when Jesus sends his disciples on their very first little foray out to do ministry, he specifically instructs them not to do cross-cultural ministry. So this is in Matthew 10, verse 5. So the whole Matthew 10 is a whole chapter of instructions, right? This is where if you come into a town and they accept you, then stay there. Don't take a money purse. If they reject you, then knock the dirt off your feet as you leave the town. We're all sort of familiar with that passage. It's interesting what it starts with. Verse 5 records these instructions. Jesus sent out the 12 apostles with these instructions. Don't go to the Gentiles or to the Samaritans, but only to the people of Israel, God's lost sheep. Go and announce to them that the kingdom of heaven is near. Right? So this is their first trip out. Don't go to the Gentiles. Don't go to the Samaritans. Right? This is your first experience with ministry. I'm going to send you to the Jews, the people that have all the same cultural understandings, assumptions. Let's start there. Now, of course, they didn't stop there. The whole book of Acts is about them breaking way beyond this, right? This is just mission trip number 1. So if you've never done any sort of evangelism or missions work, probably shouldn't start doing it cross-culturally. Spend some time teaching Sunday school or something like that, something where everybody sort of has the same understanding. And then God may lead you to do this kind of work. So now, as I look for examples of cross-cultural ministry, Jesus actually there's a great story, and this is our third encounter with the Samaritans. And this is the one we're going to spend the most time on, because it's my favorite encounter with the Samaritans, where Jesus does cross-cultural ministry, and I want to draw some stuff out of that encounter. So if you want to follow along, let's go to 4th chapter of John. And some of you already know the story, the woman at the well. So we start in verse 1. So to set it up, Jesus is traveling. Jesus knew the Pharisees had heard that he was baptizing and making more disciples than John. Though Jesus himself didn't baptize, his disciples did. So he left Judea and returned to Galilee. Circumstances have forced Jesus to be on the move, right? So he's doing ministry. The guys in power hear about it. They hear some stuff that's not quite accurate. Time to move. Right? So this isn't a planned encounter. He didn't get up in the morning and tell his disciples, let's go do some cross-cultural ministry. He was just going from point A to point B, and he was forced to go that way because he was escaping some threat. Verse 4, he had to go through Samaria on the way. It was just on the way. It wasn't where he was going. Eventually he came to the Samaritan village of Sychar, near the field that Jacob gave to his son Joseph. Jacob's well was there, and Jesus, tired from the long walk, sat wearily beside the well about noontime. Soon a Samaritan woman came to draw water, and Jesus said to her, "Please give me a drink." He was alone at the time, because his disciples had gone into the village to buy food. So the request for a drink is shocking. We don't get it, so let me unpackage it for you. But actually what Jesus was doing here is blowing through a whole bunch of cultural taboos. This entire encounter should not be happening. So Jesus is a male, he's Jewish, and he's a respected teacher. This woman is a woman, and she's a Samaritan, and the reason she's here at noon is because she's a woman who doesn't have a very good reputation in her community. So these are people on the opposite ends of respectability and social understanding, and they should not be having an interaction. And both of them, it's a little bit uncomfortable, right? She did not come to the well expecting to encounter anybody. She's come to the well at the hottest part of the day so that she can be alone there and escape the judging eyes and comments and whispers that she always gets when she's hanging out with other people. And Jesus is just taking a break on a long walk waiting for lunch. He's hot and tired. She's uncomfortable that he's there, and he had good reason to be uncomfortable as well, at least physically. So what should have happened, what their societies dictated should have happened, is they should have politely ignored each other. She should have drawn the water and scurried away and have been gone, and not a word should have been exchanged. This is two cultures that don't like each other, and this is what should have happened. So you need to step across the gap. Jesus' question steps across a huge gap. He says, I know that you're of that culture, I'm of this culture, I'm male, you're female, I'm a respected teacher, and she doesn't know that he knows what he knows about her yet, but he says, can I have a drink of water? And by doing so, he steps across a whole bunch of gaps and says, we're going to do something completely different than what ought to happen here. So she's not particularly used to that, so she reacts with a little bit of surprise. Verse 9, the woman was surprised. Right? I'm not interpreting anything it says. She's surprised. For Jews refuse to have anything to do with Samaritans. That was putting it mildly. She said to Jesus, you are a Jew, and I am a Samaritan woman. Why are you asking me for a drink? Jesus replied, if you only knew the gift God has for you and who you are speaking to, you would ask me, and I would give you living water. So she doesn't understand why Jesus is talking to her. Now, I wish that we actually had some director's notations, right? So when you read Shakespeare, there's director's notations. You understand why people say what they say generally, right? So she's surprised. I know that because it tells me that. So then he tells her that I've got this gift. So perhaps she was thinking this is too good to be true. And what Jesus is saying is, well, if you think this is too good to be true, wait till what I've got to offer you, right? Perhaps that's what's going on. Perhaps she's just surprised, and Jesus is saying, well, the reason I'm stepping across the gap, right, the reason I'm making this effort to talk to you is because I've got something good for you. Let me share that with you. And what we have to offer the world is much better than anything they've experienced before, right? What we've got is a good thing. And as we step across the gap, people may notice that. People may notice that their life of selfish pleasure isn't turning out nearly as well as your life, and they may express some surprise about that, and they may start asking, well, how is it that your life is much better, right? So her question, she recognizes, oh, he's offering me something good, but I'm not sure how this works, so she follows up with some questions. Verse 11, but sir, you don't have a rope or a bucket, she said, and this well is very deep. Where would you get this living water? And besides, do you think you're greater than our ancestor Jacob, who gave us this well? How can you offer better water than he and his sons and his animals enjoyed? Jesus replied, anyone who drinks this water will soon become thirsty again. But those who drink the water I give will never be thirsty again. It becomes a fresh, bubbling spring within them, giving them eternal life. Please, sir, the woman said, give me this water. Then I will never be thirsty again, and I won't have to come to get water in the middle of the day trying to avoid all my neighbors. Right? So she realizes, wow, this is a really good thing you've got to offer me. How do I get this? And she's starting to understand just how attractive this offer is. And certainly God may be blessing you, and your neighbors and colleagues may be noticing how your family seems more functional, your relationships seem more functional, and starting to think that's pretty attractive. You may be going through a really hard time, and your colleagues and neighbors may be noticing how you've got some joy in that suffering that they don't understand. I would hope that everyone we encounter notices how we treat them with respect and honor and care about them in a way that they don't often encounter with other people. And then they start asking, what's this about? But as they start to explore that, and as you start to explain that, and you're offering something better, often something gets in the way. And one of the stumbling blocks, of course, is sin. So she wants what Jesus has to offer, but there's something in the way, and now he's going to do a little bit of an unveil and point out to her what might be interfering with her accepting his gift. Verse 16, "Go and get your husband," Jesus told her. "I don't have a husband," the woman replied. Jesus said, "You're right. You don't have a husband, for you have had 5 husbands, and you aren't even married to the man you're living with now. You certainly spoke the truth." So Jesus issues a challenge, right? Go get your husband. Then we'll talk more about this wonderful living water. She chooses to take a risk, and she's honest. And Jesus applauds the honesty. He doesn't condemn her. He doesn't say, "You're right, sinful, awful woman." He says, he gently points out, this might be wrong. She's honest, and he says, "You were honest. Good job. That's great." And you would think that at this point, conversion would occur, right? You'd think that this would be the end. She would say, you know that I'm this person, and yet you still want to talk to me. Let's go there. But for whatever reason, she doesn't like where this conversation has ended up. And often, if you get talking about sin, you don't like where it gets ending up. And so she tries to get them off of this topic onto something else. She tries to engage him in a theological debate. How many of you have been engaged with one of your peers about Christianity, and somehow the conversation gets sidetracked onto something about rules, right? They seem to get hung up on rules. And that's exactly where she goes. She wants to talk about the rules. Verse 19, "Sir," the woman said, "you must be a prophet." And I got to know, she might think he's a prophet, and therefore it's good to ask him these questions. Maybe. Maybe she's just trying to get the topic off, and so she compliments him in return, right? He's complimented her, she compliments him, "You must be a prophet, let's talk about something other than me." "So tell me," verse 20, "why is it that you Jews insist that Jerusalem is the only place of worship, while we Samaritans claim it is here at Mount Gerizim where our ancestors worshipped?" Jesus replied, "Believe me, dear woman, the time is coming when it will no longer matter whether you worship the Father on this mountain or in Jerusalem. You Samaritans know very little about the one you worship, while we Jews know all about him, for salvation comes through the Jews. But the time is coming, indeed it is here now, when true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and in truth. The Father is looking for those who will worship him that way. For God is spirit, so those who worship him must worship in spirit and in truth." So don't be surprised when conversations with non-Christians get directed into disputes about rules. And don't let yourself get sidetracked to there. Right? She wants to go there, and Jesus could have engaged her on that, but he brought the conversation back to her. He said, "You know what? You're in error. You're in error about worship, but her error isn't what she thinks. Her error is not thinking that Gerizim is the right place to worship, and in thinking that worship requires any specific place. Right? So she wants an answer to where's the right place to worship. And Jesus' answer is, place doesn't matter anymore. Right? He says you're wrong, but redirects her back to relationship and relationship with God. And how God is going to want relationship, and that doesn't matter where you go to get relationship with him. Right? He keeps moving it back to her and her issues and relationship with God. And she doesn't like that anymore, right? She wants to get back into rules. She wants to settle this theological debate. Jesus isn't going to settle that for her. So she tries to play the ultimate trump card and terminate the conversation, right? And so what the trump card she tries to play is, well, neither one of us can really know what's true. Right? How many of you have been in a conversation where somebody played that trump card? Well, how do any of us know what's really true? And of course, at that time and place, what was going to be true was going to be figured out by the Messiah. So in this cultural concept, this is how the who knows what's true trump card gets played. Verse 25, "The woman said, 'I know the Messiah is coming, the one who is called Christ. When he comes, he will explain everything to us.'" Right? That's the trump card. Well, you say it's this, I say it's that. How does anyone know what's true? And of course, where's truth going to come from? It's going to come from the Messiah. Neither one of us are the Messiah, so there's no point in this conversation carrying on, right? Of course, what she doesn't know, of course, is that Jesus has an even bigger trump card, right? And he's going to be able to play that in a moment. And I don't know if she was just trying to close the conversation or she was actually in despair, right? I don't know if it was one of these, well, nobody knows truth, let's stop talking, or one of these, nobody knows truth, I wish we could get there. I don't know, again, where she was emotionally, right? Which one? But it doesn't slow down Jesus for a second, right? He's initiated a conversation with her, and he's revealed that he did so despite her sin. He's got one last thing he's going to reveal. Verse 26, Jesus told her, I am the Messiah. Then his disciples come back. They were shocked to find him talking to a woman, but none of them had the nerve to ask, what do you want with her, or why are you talking to her? The woman left her water jar beside the well and ran back to the village, telling everyone, come and see a man who has told me everything I ever did. Could he possibly be the Messiah? So the people came streaming from the village to see him. So the revelation that Jesus is the Christ is that she's been waiting for. That's what brings conversion. It's the encounter with Christ. And of course, that's what always brings conversion, is when someone finally sees Christ truly for who he is. It either brings conversion or rejection, but it requires a decision. And that's the point where she's got a decision to make, and she embraces him and drops her water jar and runs away to tell other people about him. Of course, the disciples show up, right? And their reaction is to see all the ways that this entire interaction is entirely inappropriate, right? And how he ought not to be having this conversation. What did he want with her? What are they doing? What's this about? And finally she runs away. Good, let us get back to what we were doing, which was traveling somewhere else and eating lunch, right? So one of the other things you may encounter when you do cross-cultural ministries is that some of the people in your culture don't really understand what you're up to. All they could see was this entire interaction is really inappropriate and I'm hungry. Verse 31, meanwhile, the disciples were urging Jesus, Rabbi, eat something. But Jesus replied, I have a kind of food you know nothing about. Did someone bring him food while we were gone? The disciples asked each other. Then Jesus explained, my nourishment comes from doing the will of God who sent me and from finishing his work. You know the saying, 4 months between planting and harvest. But I say, wake up and look around. The fields are already ripe for harvest. The harvesters are paid good wages, and the fruit they harvest is people brought to eternal life. What joy awaits both the planter and the harvester alike. You know the saying, one plants and another harvests? And it's true. I sent you to harvest where you did not plant. Others have already done the work, and now you will get to gather the harvest. Many Samaritans from the village believed in Jesus because the woman had said, he told me everything I ever did. When they came out to see him, they begged him to stay in their village. So he stayed for 2 days. So a bit of a layover. Wasn't part of their planning. I don't know if the disciples ever got lunch. Long enough for many more to hear his message and believe. Then he said to the woman, now you believe, not just because of what you told us, but because we have heard him ourselves. Now we know that he is indeed the Savior of the world. So Jesus knows she's run off to find her neighbors, right? This is a ministry opportunity that is urgent and way more important than lunch. And he's trying to get his disciples to see that. They eventually get it. They eventually launch a church that has crossed every boundary that sin has ever constructed, right? Eventually, with the Spirit's help, they get there. But today, not so much. Certainly, cross-cultural ministry is something you've got to make a priority. There will be lots of other things that get in the way. Lots of day-to-day affairs that have to be done. Your plans, we were going there. This is lunchtime, right? All of these things. You've got to prioritize it or it just isn't going to happen. The motivation has to be one of gratitude. I think that's why she encountered Christ and was so amazed and grateful that she had to tell everybody else. And once they heard, they were also grateful to her. One more story involving Samaritans before we get to the story. Luke 17, verse 11. Jesus continued on toward Jerusalem. He reached the border between Galilee and Samaria, right? So they were going to Galilee. They've now reached it. As he entered a village there, 10 lepers stood at a distance, crying out, Jesus, Master, have mercy on us. He looked at them and said, go show yourselves to the priests. And as they went, they were cleansed of their leprosy. One of them, when he saw that he was healed, came back to Jesus shouting, praise God. He fell at the ground at Jesus' feet, thanking him for what he'd done. This man was a Samaritan. Jesus asked, didn't I heal 10 men? Where are the other 9? Has no one returned to give glory to God except this foreigner? And Jesus said to the man, stand up and go. Your faith has healed you. Two things I notice in this story. One is how suffering breaks down cultural barriers, right? This is the only group of Jews and Samaritans happily hanging out together because they both had leprosy and both were outcasts from their society. And I think it's interesting in the history of the church how often connections across cultures have happened because the outcasts of both cultures end up connecting to Christ. And these big gaps that the disciples and the learned Jews had, once you were outcast from Jewish society and had leprosy, you hung out with anyone else who'd hang out with you. And all of these things didn't matter anymore. The second thing is how rare gratitude is. Right? 10% of the healed came back to say thank you. And 10% is probably a fairly accurate number for gratitude. All right, so I told you, I promised we would get back to the story. So I hope I've convinced you that we're the Samaritans. And the choice is, are we going to be bad Samaritans? Are we going to be those who are angry and upset with those that disagree with us? Why can't they just see it, that we're right and they're wrong? Are we going to be those who frustrate Christ's efforts to cross cultural boundaries because we're too busy with our lives, too busy with things going on? Or are we going to be the good Samaritans, the Samaritans that want to spend time with Christ, get to know him, that come back and thank him, and out of thankfulness want to tell other people about him? So Good Samaritan is in Luke chapter 10, verse 25. Now, I've taken some liberties with the text. So you'll recognize that there's some differences if you follow along. But I wanted to make this a little more relevant to our day-to-day lives. So starting in verse 25, but I'm going to paraphrase a bit. One day, an important doctor stood up to test Jesus by asking him this question. Teacher, what should I do to be an effective witness for you and thus inherit eternal reward? Jesus replied, what does the law of Moses say about your priorities? How do you read it? The man answered, you must love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, all your strength, and all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. Right, Jesus told him, do this and you will be an effective witness for me. The man wanted to place limits on the circle of people that he would have to love sacrificially, so he asked Jesus, and who is my neighbor? Jesus replied with a story. A wealthy young physician was traveling from finishing medical school, seeking to reach the end of a career marked by the respect of his colleagues and making an important difference in the world. Early in the journey, he encountered fatigue, pride, pursuit of pleasure, impossible expectations and suffering he could not relieve. These bandits stripped him of his family, his marriage, his sense of hope, and his reason for living. They left him wounded and half dead, pursuing pleasures that never satisfied. By chance, a Christian doctor shared an office with this physician, but when he initiated conversation about important moral issues in healthcare with the wounded colleague, he was met with rejection and anger. So the Christian doctor began crossing the office using a different hallway that didn't pass by the wounded colleague. A Christian nurse also noticed the blustery doctor, but he seemed pretty content partying on weekends and always having a different young woman on his arm. So the Christian nurse worked with the wounded doctor, but didn't really see him. Then an immigrant hospital janitor, who no one ever really noticed, saw through the mask of the wounded physician, and he felt compassion for him. Repeatedly taking time to say hello and take an interest in the wounded doctor, the janitor began to soothe the doctor's wounds with other-centered love and the example of a better way to find joy and satisfaction. It took months before the relationship went anywhere and years before healing became visible. It cost the janitor much time and emotional energy, but the janitor committed to God that he would pay any price to see the doctor's wounds healed. Finishing the story, Jesus asked the important doctor, now which of these three would you say was a neighbor to the man who was attacked by bandits? The doctor replied, the one who showed him mercy. Then Jesus said, yes, now go and do the same. And with that, I'll throw it open for discussion and comments. It's interesting, whenever Jesus talks about the Pharisees' knowledge and teaching, he has only praise. Whenever he talks about their practice, he has nothing but criticism. Right? So it's that they knew the right thing to do, but didn't do it. right? And I think that's one of the hats I wear is ethics. And one of the great frustrations is that continually encountering those that know the right thing to do, but don't, right? And it's about motivation and about... what's interesting, though, is that Jesus actually knew the law better than the Pharisees. In some sense, that Jesus had read all the books too, but realized that living it out looked very differently than the way they lived it out, which for me is scary, right? It tells me that if I live my Christianity only engaging Scripture and rules and thinking, I might end up living a Christianity that's very far off the mark. Growing up Pentecostal, I have also encountered those that live their faith emotionally, and they can get pretty far off the mark too. And of course, us A-type personalities see how they're off the mark a lot easier than we see how we're off the mark. Yeah. No, I think that's true. And I think that for me, what I'm left with is that those people are really hard to reach, right? That it's most miraculous when you get through to one of those people. That it comes down to being in relationship with somebody like that long enough and being transparent enough long enough for them to start to see that you're different, right? Because the differences aren't apparent right off the top. And sometimes it's actually when the day-to-day gets shook up, right? When they're suffering, or and they see
when they get leprosy.
Exactly, or there's something happens, or they see you encountering something, and then But you're right. Somebody who it may take a long time in relationship and a long time being transparent before they start to see what you have to offer. Because superficially, if you stay superficial with that person, they'll never see that you're any different than them. Because the differences are deeper. And that's, it's relational evangelism, right? And that's a lot of work that comes before harvest. In some ways, it's interesting. Jesus was saying to the disciples, the harvest is ready to go. All the work's been placed. I've arrived at the right time, and there's a huge harvest about to happen. And of course, Acts is the harvest happening, right? Jesus coming, that prophecy coming true. I think where we live now, the fields are a lot more mixed, and there certainly are a lot of areas where there's a lot to be done even before planting can begin, and that's relational work and time spent together. And I think of these guys that go off to the mission field that spend their entire lives to see one convert, right? And then a generation or two later is when the huge harvest comes. And some of the people that you may spend your entire life working the earth, but that's equally valuable work to do. In some sense, the differences are becoming more obvious to the culture around us. As the Judeo-Christian veneer gets thinner and thinner and thinner, and sort of the post-Christian residue, if you will, starts to wash away, I think Christians are starting to look more and more different. And there's all sorts of tensions that are coming up because of that. But at the same time, that that's happening, misconceptions about Christianity are starting to disappear because knowledge of Christianity is disappearing as well. So I think that and again, I'm hugely simplifying here, but I think that my parents' generation sort of walked out of church, and my generation sort of grew up with sort of in an anti-church kind of environment. My son's generation is growing up in a just non-churched, right? Witnessing, and you encounter that. You'll encounter some people that are quite anti-Christ, right? They understand a lot of Christian stuff and got some angry opinions about it. And you'll encounter some people who have some knowledge of Christianity, but really don't think much about it at all. And then anybody under sort of 30, you'll encounter a lot of them who have no concept at all of Christianity, which actually is really quite exciting because you no longer have to take apart all of the hostility, because now it's just a lack of knowledge, which is actually much easier to work with than hostility. So I think that in some sense, the planting is getting easier because it's something new and different and something that nobody's ever heard of before and that they have no preconceived notions about anymore. They have no knowledge at all, and so you have to start really far back and can't assume any knowledge about anything, and you have to be really careful not to use Christian language because there is a generation that if you use Christian language, you'll get anger. The next generation, you use Christian language, you get a blank stare, right? And both generations, you got to be careful not to use Christian language. You got to use a different language. But I wonder if in some sense it's getting easier because the hostility is disappearing. The gap is not as big. I think it's easier to cross the gap of ignorance than it is to cross a gap of hostility. I mean, Jesus got to do cross-cultural ministry in Fast Forward. I don't know if you noticed that in the story of the woman at the well, right? Because I think we have to have deep, meaningful conversations to figure out where the other person's heart is at, and Jesus just perceived, right? That's why he can go from talking about water to talking about eternal life to talking about a temple to conversion, right? And the time it takes the disciples to buy lunch, right? What we have to do is now, and again, sometimes the Spirit may enable you to do that, right? As a gift, the Spirit may allow you to get to the heart of an issue. But I think what you're very right, that most of the time, it's a long process of being transparent and being willing to talk about tough things and being in relationship to get to understanding the other. And we think things we think are going to be a big deal aren't. The other thing you encounter is that things you think won't be a big deal turn out to be. Which again comes out of whenever you do cross-cultural ministry, there's a lot of assumptions that each side makes about the other, right? If you were talking to somebody from another culture, you'd know that you had a lot of assumptions about them that might not be true, and they would know they had a lot of assumptions about you that might not be true, and it takes relationship. So part of the principle there is having things in the environment that are clues, right? So if it's your office and your clinic room, then the posters you put on the wall, maybe the music that plays, some of that there may be Christian or faith clues in that, which certainly somebody for whom Christianity may be something they understand, who's sort of wandered away, who that may clue them to get back. So again, this idea that I think you'll never get in trouble if the impetus comes from the patient, right? And so having things in the environment that might cause somebody to say, oh, I saw this poster, or that reminds me of something that if the patient brings it up, you can't get is there. You're not going to get in trouble with that. But certainly as a family doctor, you take their medical history and their surgical history, their meds, allergies. So how much exercise do you get in a week, right? You take a exercise history. Tell me a little bit about your diet, right? Tell me about your family history. We ask all sorts of embarrassing questions, right? And one of them is, something like, how important is spirituality to you and your life? Are there certain things about your culture or your faith that may be relevant to how I provide medical care for you, right? Just routine questions that are on your list that open a door, that say, you know what, I acknowledge that your faith or whatever, your spirituality, whatever term you want to use, may be important to how we do medicine. And as you say, you may be amazed the answers you get. And for how many patients that spirituality and faith is a huge part of their life, and again, if they've initiated and you follow their lead, then, again, there still is a generation in Canada that grew up going to Sunday school, right? That still, when they get that census form, they're like, well, I'm not Hindu, I'm not Buddhist, I'm not Muslim, I'm not really other, I'm not sure what that is, I guess I'm Christian. Tick, right? Who, again, in moments of crisis, that's where they go back to. So listen to the Spirit, and I certainly know some physicians that will make an offer of prayer quite routine, right? They'll say, some patients facing a challenge like this find that prayer or some other spiritual practice is very helpful. Is that you at all? And if the patient, if they endorse that in any way, say, well, do you want me to pray for you, right? And yes, and I remember talking to one physician who was amazed at how many times when he did that, the patient in the next bed over would pipe up afterwards and say, can you pray for me too? Right? Not even their patient, but they've overheard the conversation and want to be prayed for too. But one of the things you should always do is to document well, right? So I think if you've chosen to pray with a patient, it might be we're doing a one-liner in the chart. Discuss spirituality, patient indicated interest in prayer, offered prayer, patient accepted, pray for patient, right? And again, that the patient's not going to get upset with you, but then 3 days later the patient drops dead, and some family member goes back through the chart and has got an axe to grind with Christians, and you've got it somewhere, that again you've done consent, and that's generally true of everything in medicine, right? And if they're angry about their weight, you'll document somewhere in the chart, don't talk about their weight, right? Because on this day they got angry. Again, a different colored chart for the patients that can't face their BMI, but you can document, right? And there are ways, especially in electronic charts, to make certain things be flagged and in ways that aren't nearly as intrusive as colored. The other thing, of course, is a bunch of us don't have charts of any color.
That's right.
So they're all in a box in the server, yep. But I think the concluding thought I will give you, and it's a great anecdote, is that one of the most powerful ways you witness is simply by living a Christian life and talking about your faith like it's just another part of your life, right? And so one of the ways that I find, again, I don't have much opportunity to witness to patients because I don't have any ongoing relationship with anybody that lasts longer than 9 months, right? Now, sometimes I come back a year or two later, I get to take care of them for another 9 months, but, so I'm an OBGYN, sorry, for those that don't know where I'm from. But I am part of a small town where everybody I work with knows where I live, and most of them know who Beth is, and they know where my son's at. And so in conversation, I mention, well, at church on Sunday morning, this or that. Or where are you, like everybody in my office, today was blocked off, talking in Orangeville, right? So all the ladies say, oh, you're going to Orangeville tonight. It's a little snowy. What are you talking about? Oh, it's a CMDS talk, right? And I don't have to explain. I had 5-6 years ago to explain what that was. And like, oh, will that be on your website? Yeah, it is. I think all the ladies at the front have watched all these things on tape. And there's Christian music that plays in my office, right? And medical students spend 4 weeks with me, and we get into great conversations about that. So part of it is just living your life. So the story I'll end with, and again, the discussion can carry on for as long as people want to hang around, but we should formally end. It's a story, I was not part of this interaction, but it was relayed to me by a very non-Christian, hostile to Christianity doctor told me this story, that when he was a young doctor, there had been a senior physician, a senior surgeon, who had, everybody knew, he went to church all the time. This guy, he was the Bible banger, right? Everybody knew this. And he came in one evening and he also was always dressed very well. Doctors that generation did. They'd come in wearing the tie and the whole bit. So he came in one evening to see somebody who was having some bowel issues. And before they had lots of fancy cameras, there was a device that you would put through the rectum to observe the lower part of the rectum to see if there were things in the way. And there was a little door on the end of it, right, that had, some of you remember this, that was glass, and you put the door down so you could see in. So this patient had some sort of issue that required him to do this exam, and he forgot to put the door down. So he stuck this in, and the patient was having explosive diarrhea. So the gentleman is covered from head to toe, right, because he forgot to fish the little door down. This is tie, bow tie, everything, suit jacket, head to toe. He's covered in feces. And this very non-Christian doctor said, you know what that guy said? All he said was, oh oh my, and then walked away, right? And this guy remembered this like decades later. So it's amazing the situations you find yourself in where you have a chance to witness. And he remembered that this is all this guy said in that moment, when most doctors would have had more words to use, colorful language to use in that situation. Let me pray for you guys.